This is Christy, and we have merchandise. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com and check out amazing t-shirts, mugs, stickers. If you love great quotes, we have some of our favorites. If you love silliness, check out our mascot, Brain Man. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com, click on the shop button, and find something for that person who needs to be reminded that we are fashioned creatures but half made up. Mary Shelley said that.
To get people excited about Boost Mobile's new nationwide 5G network, we're offering unlimited talk, text, and data for $25 a month.
Forever.
Even if you have a baby.
Even if your baby has a baby.
Even if you grow old and wrinkly and you start repeating yourself.
Even if you start repeating yourself.
Even if you're on your deathbed and you need to make one last call.
Or text.
Right, or text. The long-lost son you abandoned at birth.
You'll still get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile.
Forever!
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Forever.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hi, I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. In 1825, a legendary man by the name of William C. Faulkner was born in northern Mississippi. His life read like a novel. He was described as a dashing young man, good-looking and daring. Twice he was acquitted of murder charges. He was a colonel in a group of raiders for the Confederate Army, and by the end of his life he would own a railroad but would die as a member of the state legislature, murdered by the hand of a former railroad partner who he had beaten for that seat in the legislature. I mean, this sounds like a made-up story, but it isn't. This is the true story of the grandfather of the man that we'll be discussing this week and next. And that man is the Nobel Prize-winning writer William Faulkner, who made up and embellished stories as crazy as that of his beloved grandfather.
But knowing that your family story is that crazy, maybe it's no wonder William Faulkner, the writer who was born in 1897, would grow up to create a mythical world out of the Mississippi Delta and populate it with characters just as colorful as his own granddaddy. It's also no wonder he turned his entire life story into something of a legend, continuously weaving truth into fiction, totally confusing and entertaining the general public with stories no one really knew who he really was. In 1956, Faulkner had this to say: "I created a cosmos of my own. I like to think of the world I created as being a kind of keystone in the universe." Of course, he was talking about Yakanatapawpha County, the story world of his novels and short stories, and into which we'll go today to meet Miss Emily Grierson. But he might have just as well been talking about himself and his own life. On another occasion, he said this: "The reason I don't like interviews is that I seem to react violently to personal questions. If the questions are about the work, I try to answer them. When they are about me, I may answer or I may not. But even if I do, if the same question is asked tomorrow, the answer may be different.
It's like he entertained himself, just deluding the public and making his life something more akin to the exciting real myth of his grandfather's life was, than his own more normalized story of heartache and disappointment. It's like he was saying, I don't want to be judged on anything but my work, and I don't feel compelled to expose my true life story to the world.
Well, of course, coming from one of the poorest and undereducated regions, but also one of the proudest regions of the United States, this kind of makes sense. But it also shows just how remarkable this man was, who didn't even give people the satisfaction of knowing if his name should or should not have a U in it. Truly. Faulkner was never a wealthy man, but he started as a really poor kid. He was a high school dropout, and yet by 1949, he had won the Nobel Prize for Literature and the Pulitzer twice. Over the course of a relatively short period of time, he wrote 19 novels, more than 125 short stories, as well as several screenplays. His work was primarily experimental. He engaged the world through stream of conscious writing. He wanted us to understand just how complicated truth and judgment really are. And as a result, his work is really difficult to read. And during his lifetime, it didn't sell well. It's absolutely impossible to make sense of a Faulkner novel if you're just given it a one-time read. It's a mental workout to the point that by 1945, nearly all of his novels were completely out of print.
And yet, they endure, and 4 years later, he had a Nobel Prize. And today and next episode, we read what might be his most accessible story. It's a mostly straightforward narrative that can be found in almost every American literature anthology in print today, and it's titled A Rose for Emily. It's Southern Gothic, it's creepy, it's funny, and for a lot of people, it's their entry point into the complicated mind of its creator. And I would like to point out, we are currently about 90 miles away from Roanoke, his home, and honestly, we have met these people that he talks. They are real people in this world.
For most students, Emily's story is just as far as they want to go into Yakanapapa County. I got an Instagram message from a student the other day. His name is Chris, and he was just checking in after so many years, and he had kind things to say, which is fun, but he did say this, which I found funny. He said, and I quote, I still, to this day, hate As I Lie Dying. I will never forget that book. The period of time we were reading that book is the only time I dreaded your class. It made me laugh. His reaction, albeit common, is so visceral that he can remember the book a decade later.
Oh, my gosh. Well, first of all, I think Faulkner would be proud, but there's a good reason for his reaction. As I Lie Dying, for those of you who don't know, is a Faulkner novel. We've said before that stories are experienced truth, and if you don't understand what I mean by that, read Faulkner. He says things about the human condition in his novels and short stories that would take volumes to explain in a textbook, but they are truly disturbing, and how he expresses them is disturbing too. For most of his works, Faulkner introduces life through stream of consciousness, experiences that inhabit the lives of many and often disturbed individuals. And his perspective is multifaceted, and it illustrates ideas that in reality often can't be explained with philosophy or psychology nearly as well as they can through narrative. In fact, in that same novel that you just referenced, As I Lay Dying, the title character, who is actually dead and whose corpse is being transported, Addie Bundren, famously says, "Words are no good. They don't ever fit even when what they are trying to say at."
I love that line, and sometimes it's really true. Words don't even fit. I mean, it's ironic that a writer says that, but so often we don't say what we mean, and even if we try, it doesn't mean what we think. And what we reveal by what we do may be something that we don't even understand ourselves. That's what Faulkner shows us in his stories.
That's especially obvious in the American South. As someone who moved here as a young man from the Midwest, I can tell you, a newcomer doesn't know exactly what he's looking at when he first gets here. And if he only listens to the words, he may be confused most of the time, because words in the South don't mean the same as they do in other regions of the country. It's in the South. In the South, it's not always what you say. Sometimes it's what you don't say. And we'll see that very vividly in A Rose for Emily.
Well, of course, the American South isn't the only place like that. Lots of places are like that. But in this context, it is the American South, the post-Civil War, broken American South. A South plagued by racial injustice, poverty, ignorance, a civil war, among other things that man can see and he can express in this context our human condition very vividly. If we're honest, when we read this, we see ourselves in these stories at our most raw. Flannery O'Connor, another Southern writer we've discussed here on the podcast, called her homeland the Christ-haunted South. Not because she was against Christianity. I mean, she wasn't. She was an ardent Christian. But because she saw man in his spiritual essence full of tensions and conflicts that were exposed in the context of her homeland. And we were unable to hide here behind this raw humanity. I mean, there's not any money or culture left to conceal us. Inside of all of us is both justice and injustice and noble pride and rotten arrogance and love for our community, but at the same time, hypocritical judgment. A single person embraces Christian charity, but also expresses demonic oppression. This is the reality Faulkner writes into life, all rolled up into a self-contained community he called Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi.
Let me congratulate you on your pronunciation of that. Just to clarify, Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, with Jefferson as its county seat, is not a real place. Not like Itawamba, which is a real place. Okay. In his stories, it is a 2,400 square mile area in the Mississippi Delta with a population of 15,611 persons. And Jefferson is the county seat, complete with, among other things, a jail and a town square.
Having said that, Jefferson, as he describes it, looks an awful lot like Faulkner's hometown of Oxford, Mississippi, and Yoknapatawpha County looks a lot like Lafayette County.
Some would say that he wrote about what he knew. The Mississippi Delta, his home for the entirety of his life, is where almost all of the work is set. I mean, it's a small place, but it has all kind of colorful characters, and Yoknapatawpha County is filled several generations of Native Americans, African Americans, white Americans. It has plantation owners and veterans of the Civil War and World War I and World War II. And there's rural folk, but there are exploiters, there are do-gooders, there are servants and peddlers and preachers and students, all kinds of people, all the sorts of people that live in and outside the Delta. And many of his characters were composites and fabrications of people that he actually knew. And he mined the lives of his friends and his relatives and neighbors for the stories of their lives.
But a lot of them are a lot like people we all know. They feel real because they are real in many ways. And Faulkner began mining the lives of his community well before he was a famous author. I mean, he was always a storyteller and an observer of mankind. In fact, he skipped school so much, he eventually dropped out after football season ended in his 11th grade year. He wasn't dumb. He'd been identified early on as gifted. In fact, he'd even skipped the second grade. But he didn't like school, and he had no time for it. His friend Phil Stone, who was 4 years older, was the son of a banker and a lawyer and a Yale student. And Phil Stone considered him highly gifted. So Stone mentored his wild friend in literature, helping him get quite an education in reading, but also quite an education on the wildlife. And together they visited gambling halls, roadhouses, bordellos.
All the Delta stuff. Faulkner may have impressed himself and Phil Stone with the high and carefree life, but he did not impress the parents of the girl that he really loved and wanted to marry, who was the well-to-do, popular, and prize of Oxford, Miss Linda Estelle Oldham. Her parents were not impressed with this high school dropout, and instead of blessing an engagement with Faulkner, they encouraged her to marry a more respectable man, a prominent local lawyer named Cornell Franklin, which she did to his great dismay.
Yes, and he took that marriage really hard, to the point that he left Oxford, despondent. But Phil Stone came to the rescue, and he invited Faulkner to come up to New Haven. That's where Yale is, and so Faulkner did. He decided to enlist in the aviation section of the Signal Corps of the United States, but he was rejected because of his height and his weight. He was only 5'5". So Faulkner and Phil Stone concocted another plan. Faulkner added the U to his name. At that point, it was F-A-L-K, and he added the U. They forged some references. They changed his identity. Faulkner moved to Canada to join the Canadian branch of the Royal Air Force. The goal was to learn to fly and be a pilot in World War I, a war hero, like his granddaddy. Unfortunately for Cadet Faulkner, though, the war ended before he could get to Europe. He didn't even finish learning to fly. So Faulkner did what Faulkner would do the rest of his life. He just made something up.
He did, and he went all in. He bought a Royal Air Force uniform, made up a crazy war story about being injured while flying in combat, picked up a limp, bought a cane, and came back to Oxford a self-declared war hero and veteran. I did notice that his version about his injury changed over the years in different contexts, but he told that story for years, and even after many knew he simply wasn't telling the truth.
And of course, as a veteran back in Mississippi, he was allowed to enroll in college, even without a high school diploma at the University of Mississippi, what we call Ole Miss. He studied English, Spanish, French, but this was no surprise to anyone. He only lasted a year. He just didn't like school. He went back to New York City, then came back to Oxford, took a string of odd jobs, and eventually going back to the university, but this time not as a student, but as the postmaster. Again, Phil Stone to the rescue and helped him land that job. He hated it, though. He was terrible at it, and his resignation letter is famous. Gary, would you mind reading this?
Okay. It reads like this. I will be damned if I propose to be at the beck and call of every itinerant scoundrel who has 2 cents to invest in a postage stamp. I guess I understand his frustration, but that is the job. Working in a post office is hard work. And, of course, that was 1924, the year he also published his first book. And, well, shall I say, his friend Phil Stone subsidized the publication of that first book, Marble Fawn.
And it's a book of poetry, but nobody is claiming that to be a literary masterpiece. But it was a start, and he was on his way. He wrote and he traveled for the next couple of years, going to Europe by way of New Orleans, then back to New York, all the time writing and really getting better. It wasn't until 1929 that life changed for a couple of reasons. First of all, Faulkner finally married Estelle. She had divorced Cornell Franklin and moved back to Oxford with 2 children. Faulkner would raise those children as his own, and 4 years later, Estelle and he would have a child together, Jill.
The story about Estelle marrying Cornell Franklin reminds me of the story of Daisy marrying Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. And just like Daisy, Estelle is up all night the night before her wedding to Cornell in tears, not wanting to marry him, but rather wishing to marry that penniless lover. Estelle lost her engagement ring, and just like Daisy, lost her pearls. But in both cases, the jewelry is recovered. The wedding goes on. The bride walks down the aisle to marry the rich beau, and the poor boyfriend was thrown aside, and he leaves town to seek his fortune in Europe. Doesn't that sound like a novel?
Well, the only difference is that Estelle does eventually divorce Cornell, and of course, we all know Daisy stays with Tom.
Well, there is that. And of course, as big of a deal as that is, the bigger deal is that the same year that Estelle and Faulkner finally reunite and get married, The Sound and the Fury was published, and the book was a masterpiece, and some say it's his greatest. Using unreliable characters, a complex narrative structure, and stream of consciousness writing, The Sound and the Fury became a milestone in modernist fiction. It's been considered one of the greatest novels of the 20th century.
Ironically, though, Faulkner called it a splendid failure, although he knew it was brilliant.
When he gave it to his publisher, according to his publisher, Ben Wasson, he said this, "Read this one, bud. It's a real son of a bitch. This one is the greatest I'll ever write. Just read it." And then he turned around and he walked out of the office.
Getting it published the way he wanted to publish it forced him to defend it ardently. He didn't let the editors correct the punctuation or fix the italicized sections. He wasn't making mistakes. He didn't want it, quote, fixed. The narrative structure and the syntax were on purpose. It was a work of art, and it would stay the way he crafted, no matter if it sold or not. He had given up on the idea of making money, so why not do bravely that which he wanted to do? At this point, he was just writing. And when he did that, the muses visited him. In fact, in one later edition, this was what he wrote in the preface. When I began the book, I had no plan at all. I wasn't even writing a book. Previous to it, I had written 3 novels with progressively decreasing ease and pleasure and reward or emolument. One day, it suddenly seemed as if a door had clapped silently and forever to between me and all publisher addresses and book lists, and I said to myself, well, now I can write. Now I can just write.
Well, the book was a critical success, but it was not a financial success. And, no one just sits down to relax with the stream of consciousness narrative. I mean, it's just too complex.
True. And while he was waiting for The Sound of Fury to be published after, the editing phase, he wrote another book. This one he called Sanctuary. Now, this book he did think would make money, but he let Estelle read it, and she said, it's horrible, to which he replied, it's meant to be. I mean, the key event in the novel is a rape by an impotent but lethal gangster named Popeye, who takes his victim, Temple Drake, to Memphis. When his publisher read it, he said, good God, I can't publish this. We'd both be in jail. And he didn't, until Faulkner had written and published As I Lay Dying in 1930, the one that my students and many students suffered through in high school.
Well, however poorly The Sound of the Fury sold, it did get him attention. And in 1930, Faulkner published the first short story to earn him a check, which is the one we are going to read, which is titled A Rose for Emily.
The publication, called Forum, was finally paying for one of his short stories, and it was going to come out in April of 1930. As normally happens in these cases, the magazine requested that Faulkner provide a profile of his life to be published with the story. Listen to what Faulkner sent.
Born male and single at an early age in Mississippi, quit school after 5 years in the 7th grade, got job in grandfather's bank and learned medicinal value of his liquor. Grandfather thought the janitor did it. Hard on janitor. War came, liked the British uniform, got commissioned RFC pilot, crashed, cost British government £2,000, was still pilot, crashed, cost British government £2,000, quit, cost British government $83.40. King said, well done, returned to Mississippi, family got job, postmaster, resigned by mutual agreement on part of 2 inspectors, accused of throwing all incoming mail in the garbage can. How dispose of outgoing mail never proved, inspectors foiled, had $700, went to Europe, met man named Sherwood Anderson, said, why not write novels, maybe won't have to work. Did. Soldiers Pay, did. Mosquitoes, did. The Sound and the Fury, did. Sanctuary, out next year. Now flying again, age 32, own and operate own typewriter.
I mean, it's crazy.
That had to be super frustrating to the publishers that he was toying with them like that.
I mean, he's obviously being funny, but is he making fun of himself? Is he making fun of the magazine? Is he making fun of the readers? I mean, Faulkner,
I think he's making fun of celebrity.
Maybe so. I mean, he had no interest in letting people into his private life. And since coming back from Canada, he'd pretty much committed himself to fabricating his life story. And that wasn't going to change just because he was getting famous. I mean, his entire biography is a work of creative writing, loosely based on some facts.
Well, to me, Faulkner's created a character here. Maybe it's to mask some of the more embarrassing parts of his life story, or maybe to reveal others. It's certainly funny, which in itself tells us something about him.
Correct. The narrator in this little bio has a bit of narrative distance between himself and the Faulkner that he's describing. I mean, the Faulkner is the butt of the joke, but it's not a mean description. I mean, it's playful. He's making fun of some of his lowest moments, like losing that job at the post office.
That post office thing was a mess, and the idea resigned by mutual agreement is an understatement as to what actually happened. I mean, he was a horrible postmaster. He opened and closed the post office whenever he wanted to with no regular hours. And he regularly threw people's mail in the trash, and he read people's magazines before giving them to him. He used the back room of the post office to play poker. I mean, it got so bad, the United States Post Office sent an inspector to Oxford to investigate, and the only reason he wasn't fired was because his family was prominent, so they just let him resign.
So we see that Faulkner, as a person, is just as colorful and flawed as the characters in his stories. But now let's turn our attention to the story that would become his most popular, A Rose for Emily. I mean, it's been analyzed tens of thousands of times over the years and from every perspective imaginable. Sometimes critics look at it through things like plot and point of view and narrative technique. And as we read it, we're going to see that there's a lot to talk about. The narrator is ambiguous. I mean, maybe he's an elderly person looking back some 50 years over the course of a long series of events. Maybe he's one of Emily's contemporaries. I've read articles claiming both things, but it's certainly not clear from the story itself who he is. A lot of articles are about the chronology of the events because they don't make sense either. I mean, the story is told backwards. One article said the chronology not being in normal chronological order makes the story easier to understand. But I'm not really sure that's true at all. I mean, the narrator only provides one date the whole time. But even if you center all the events around that one event, counting years back and forth to try to create a timeline, there's still a lot of questions that just don't make sense. The truth of the matter is, the exact timeline doesn't matter at all. It's not supposed to matter. It makes no sense on purpose, and there's a line in the story that explains how memory does that to us as we age, and we look back on our lives just that way. Faulkner calls time as we age, quote, not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. And it is kind of like that. This story, Faulkner divides into 5 parts. The narrator reminisces in each separate section, and each section is grouped around 2 major events. So we have 2 events per section. It's how the narrator remembers the events. Today we'll look closely at the first section, and in the next episode we'll look at the other 4. But before we do, I want to read one more comment from Faulkner as he describes his process as a writer, because I think it holds true for everything he wrote, be it a novel or a short story. Faulkner says this about his process. There's always a moment in experience, a thought, an incident that's there. Then all I do is work up to that moment. I figure what must have happened before to lead people to that particular moment, and I work away from it, finding out how people act after the moment. Of course, you can see that's what's happening in all of his novels, but you can really see it in this little short story that we're going to read. Gary, let's read the first sentence of A Rose for Emily, and then let's chat. As with most every author we read, Faulkner gives away a lot of what he wants to talk about in this very long, Nathaniel Hawthorne long-like sentence. It's long and involved.
When Miss Emily Gershon died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men, through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women, mostly out of curiosity to see inside her house, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years.
And so we meet Miss Emily, but she's dead. That is the incident, and this story will work backwards to show us what led to this moment. We see everyone in the town. They went to the funeral, but there's a sense of detachment. I mean, there's no love for Miss Emily. She's a fallen monument. She's a curiosity, but maybe not even for herself. There's a lot of interest in her house. we're also introduced to the man who took care of her until the end of her life, an old manservant.
I want to point out something that we've mentioned many times. Stories contain multiple themes, and some are political and sociological and psychological and even spiritual. And I think this story has several elements of all of that, but I mention it here because we notice that she uses the term manservant here. Later on, this same gentleman will be referred to as a Negro, and at one point there's a derogatory term used not for him, but for other African Americans. I mean, all of this plays into the political nature of the story as it pertains to the South. And we will see being symbolized, all of this, in the person of Emily Grierson as well as the house, and in part through this manservant who really protects Emily. And the name Emily has often been associated as a name of the ultimate expression of what it means to be a Southern belle. And the name itself signals an autocratic pre-Civil War hierarchy that Faulkner is really criticizing in the story. And in the Old South, a lady is always a lady, and we will see what that means. And in some ways, that cripples Emily, but in other ways, it protects her. You know, the social hierarchy of the South that uses gender and race to classify everyone is falling apart. People seem delighted to be getting into a house that no one had gotten inside of for 10 years.
It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. It's funny the way he talks about the old aristocrats as having august names. I mean, that's a word that makes us think of Augustus Caesar. But of course, these names are dead, and they're ranked among the graves with even Union soldiers and all of those who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. A reminder, that the Civil War is only one generation removed. They're august or imperial only in their own minds. I mean, the new ways are coming. There are gasoline pumps, and they're pushing out the cotton wagons. And Emily's house is called a coquettish decay. A coquette is a mean girl. She's a tease, a girl who winks at boys to get attention and then blows them off. But look, this is coquettish decay. This coquette went too far, and the new hierarchies are not based on the criteria of the past. Emily's house is an eyesore among eyesores.
Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, who had fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. There is so much of interest going on in this paragraph politically. First, we have the one date of the text, 1894. Reconstruction is over by then, but the Delta has really not been rebuilt completely. And Colonel Sartoris fathering an edict that no Negro should appear on the streets without an apron really highlights so much of the absurdity of the time. And first of all, he's fathering an edict. That's not democratic, but that's autocratic. And the edict is an attempt to create a hierarchy where African-American women can't come outside except in an apron, putting them at the bottom of the social structure. And it's absurd. And, and who made Colonel Sartoris, the lawgiver, who made him a father? And look what he's doing with it. And, of course, with the same power that he forces all African-American women to wear aprons, he arbitrarily declares that Emily Grierson should pay no more taxes by virtue of nothing but her essence, her place in the social hierarchy that is dying, or in fact, has actually died. Don't you wish we could get that kind of special dispensation? Just our essence pays our taxes.
I know. And I want to point out that last line that you read that said, only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. I mean, it's the thing you were talking about, communication in the South. And what Faulkner is communicating here is what is communicated through what is not said. Of course, everyone knows that the town of Jefferson does not owe Emily's father's money. Emily knows that too. What everyone knows is that Emily's too poor and she can't pay her taxes. No one wants to take responsibility for her, but they all feel somewhat responsible, so they just say something, even if it doesn't make sense. Emily knows what's going on. I've seen many of Southern women pull this same move. We just all say something out loud that's not true, and we all just pretend that it is, and we all understand. She's pretending to believe it's because, why would you not believe it if you don't have to pay your taxes?
That is so much confusing subtext.
Well, it is, and that's what I'm talking about. Experienced truth. I mean, living with unspoken truths, embarrassing ones, not saying things everyone knows. And what we can see from generation into generation is that some of these social agreements, the next generation just doesn't go along with. In this case, the new generation does not think Emily deserves to be catered to on the basis of nothing. Her fake pedigree and this fake agreement with Colonel Sartoris. And this story shows that, these clashes of generations occur.
When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this agreement reached some little dissatisfaction. On the first of the year, they mailed her a tax notice. February came and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later, the mayor wrote her himself offering to call or to send his car for her and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape in a thin, flowing calligraphy in faded ink to the effect that she no longer went out at all. The tax notice was also enclosed without comment. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door through which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving china painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. They were admitted by the old Negro into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. The Negro led them into the parlor. It was furnished in heavy leather-covered furniture. When the Negro opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked, and when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray. On a tarnished gilt easel before the fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. Notice as we look back in time, the old manservant has now become the old Negro. He is referenced as such 4 times.
Right, and so we see the hierarchy, and we also see the house. I mean, it's the representation of that old Southern way of life, and it smells. It's dusty. The leather of the furniture is cracked. But the most Gothic detail of all is by the fireplace, a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father.
Emily's relationship with men in this story is disturbing, but it obviously begins with her unhealthy relationship with her father, which, of course, we will develop more in the following parts of the story. But her father has idealized Emily and infantilized her. But she, in some way, has participated by having this crayon portrait of him as a centerpiece. And I also want to point out there is no mention of a mother anywhere. We'll find out as we go through the story that the only reproduction that occurs in a Grierson home is painting and, recreating illustrations from women's magazines on China. And Emily, as one with no mother, is a total creation of her father. And we'll find out there's a lot of fantasy going on in this household.
They rose when she entered. A small, fat woman in black with thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare. Perhaps that was why what would have been merely plumpness in another was obesity in her. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like 2 small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stated their errand. I want to talk about this description of Emily. It is one of the most entertaining parts of the story for me. It's awful. For a story that's so ambiguous. The dates are ambiguous. The plot's ambiguous. The narrator is ambiguous. There's absolutely no ambiguity in this description of Emily Grierson. Her body is described in the most grotesque way possible. It's like a bloated corpse. How can you be so fat, though, and have a skeleton stand out as being small and spare?
Well, if she represents the Old South, the Old South is bloated and dead, but also starving itself in some way. It doesn't know it's already dead, just as she doesn't seem to really actually be alive.
She did not ask them to sit. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. Her voice was dry and cold. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves. But we have. We are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff signed by him? Yes, a paper, yes, Miss Emily said. Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But there's nothing on the books to show that, you see. We must go by... See Colonel Sartoris. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But Miss Emily, see Colonel Sartoris. Colonel Sartoris had been dead almost 10 years. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Toby, the Negro appeared. Show these gentlemen out.
Nice voice there. Emily's not just denying death. She is denying the passage of time. And either she doesn't know Colonel Sartoris is dead or it doesn't matter to her and she refuses to accept reality. She seeks to control time. And if she's personifying the South, it shows the utter absurdity, really, of clinging to values that absolutely do not acknowledge, a current reality.
But of course, this story is not just political. It's social, psychological, spiritual. There's more than one way of looking at reality and understanding Emily Grierson. And although the political way makes a lot of sense, the personal or spiritual reading is perhaps a more tragic way to see this story. When Faulkner was asked about the title, he said this, and I want to quote him. It's an allegorical title. The meaning was, here was a woman who has had a tragedy, an irrevocable tragedy, and nothing can be done about it. And I pitied her. This was a salute. To a woman, you would hand a rose. And so next episode, we will read the rest of the story. What is the tragedy of the life of Miss Emily Grierson, the monument? We will get to see beyond the lumpy, dough-faced, coal-looking eyes. We will go back in time and see what created the tragedy.
All right. Well, until the next time we reconvene to discuss the tragedy, please check us out at our website at howtolovelitpodcast.com. You can follow us on all the social medias. We would love to hear from you. And once again, we would like to say thank you for helping us make literature accessible to all.
Peace out.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.